Hello, Caroline Reimer. I'm a solitary pagan and I'm a writer. And first of all, I'd like to apologise that it's taken me so long to get this video up. It's one hell of a busy week. The week before Christmas is always really busy, and I had a birthday at the weekend and it's very hard to get back to work. So I finally got round to it. It's 7:30. I'm trying to get this up before Winter Solstice. So if I work till midnight and possibly the day after, I might just get this up in time. If not, I apologise. I've done my best. The reason it's taking so long is because I spent so long wondering about what I was going to make a video about. And I watched a load of YouTube videos about Yule and Christmas and the origins and all this, and there's a lot out there, to be honest, and they're all very informative, but they're all very much the same about the Amanita Muscaria traditions and Santa Claus and elves and things like that. So at the last minute I just decided I didn't really want to make the same kind of video. In fact, what I wanted to talk about instead was Winter Solstice and the whole season going up to sort of 12 nights, and some of the Celtic traditions of this time, because I was looking into them, and there's the Morris dancers and the mummers and the Guisers and various traditions, and they're in danger of dying out, and they're in danger of being replaced by plastic trees with baubles. We all know about Santa and him coming down a chimney and flying on a sledge led by reindeer. So, you know, I don't need to explain that any further. There are plenty of videos out there saying that. So what I wanted to really talk about was some of the older traditions of Winter Solstice. And I think we're all pretty sure that we know that Winter Solstice is the shortest day. And in pagan times it was a very important calendrical event. And later, when Christianity came along and took over all these pagan celebrations and ceremonies, they changed it to the birth of Christ, as we know, which instead of taking place on the 21st of December took place on the 25th of December. Now some people wonder why this is. Quite plainly, it's just because the sun stands still for 3 days on the winter solstice. So the 24th and the 25th is when the sun starts to gain in its strength again. So this is what the Christians relabelled the rebirth of the sun, or the birth of the sun, who was the sun. And really, in many traditions, including in Germany, which my mother is German, so she always told me about her we open our presents on Christmas Eve tradition, which she really hates waiting till Christmas morning like we do. And the day actually started at evening, at sundown. That was the beginning of the new day in old pagan traditions. So really the 24th to the 25th is Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So yeah, it's really when the sun starts to turn back in its strength towards being higher in the sky. So that was the origin of why we place Christmas on the 25th. It's not to say that that didn't have any importance in pagan times as well. In fact, the whole season had importance. This is where we get our tradition of 12 nights from. Which is also based on Saturnalia. Yes, the fire's spitting at you. It's going to spit at me in a minute. Oh. So its importance to our ancestors was probably greater than it is to us today. It's definitely, in my opinion, an agricultural festival. And we see it as the dark of winter, you know, the longest, darkest night, and we need to feast and huddle up by the fire and eat our fill and things like that, which is quite true. It's partly to do with feasting. But it was also when they needed to mark the point of the returning sun and the returning agricultural season. So there are many monuments such as Newgrange and Stonehenge that are configured to letting them know when the winter solstice had arrived, so that they knew that the year was growing again. And of course, most famously, there's Newgrange, where a shaft of light appears at winter solstice to illuminate down the tomb the triple spiral on a stone, and it passes across the triple spiral only once in the year, and that is when the sun is shining directly down the tomb, which of course you know. And although everybody thought that Stonehenge was aligned to the midsummer solstice, it's actually probably aligned to the winter solstice. And they discovered a lot of remains of feasting at this time, and also people would travel for miles to come and feast. I don't know how they knew that people travelled for miles, but they did. People came from all over the country to come and feast at Stonehenge, and it was a great feast when they slaughtered the animals before the winter, and when new animals were born in the spring, they didn't have to feed the animals over the winter. So there was a mass slaughter, and it would seem that there is some kind of sacrifice associated with this. I'm taking it from the Nordic tradition that this may have been the case. And there was a great celebration, really. Nobody really knows what Stonehenge was about, but this was part of it. So it's still marked by fertility rituals in many old traditions in Britain. Particularly we have wassailing at this time of year. And wassailing is honouring the trees, the sacred trees, and worshipping the trees, really. And people in Devon and the southwest mainly do this, Britain. And they go and pour cider on the roots of the trees. They offer them beer, and they put bread on the trees for the birds. And they make a lot of loud noises to scare away the evil spirits, and then prayers and petitions for the trees to bring a bountiful harvest next year. And this is old Druidic law, and it changed into a quaint custom, which sadly almost died out after World War II. It just stopped happening. And it has been revived in later years, but if we're not careful, we could lose a lot of these very ancient traditions. And there are many other ancient traditions that are sadly fading away. We have one here where I live, which is mainly in the Midlands, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Yorkshire. They have a tradition called the Old Tup, and this happens on the Christmas day. And a group of play actors take around what we call a hobby horse, which is a stick with a head on it, carried by men who are hiding under a sack. And they perform a little play, and they go and knock on doors and they ask for money, and it's some of the stigma associated with it it was a form of begging. But if you look at our tradition of gift giving and charity, I suppose it relates to that. That's the way we can see it in our modern times. It's a very old tradition of giving away to the poor and sharing the benefits of your goods at this time. So they would dress up a stick with a ram's head on it called the Old Tup, and in Derbyshire and this area, a tup is a male sheep, and he would be a symbol of fertility. And they would enact this play where there was a beggar, a transvestite and Beelzebub amongst others, and they would kill the Old Tup and mime taking his blood, and it was very bawdy and quite humorous, very much like the Mummers plays were. And they knock on doors and go to the pubs and things like this and gather charity for doing their little play acting, but it has much deeper and much older symbolism in it. And it's very much like the hobby horse traditions, which are also traditionally performed around Christmas time. And one of these is called, I'm not sure I'm saying this right, the Marihlwyd. And the Marihlwyd takes place in mainly southern Wales, I think. And it is part of the Wassailing ceremonies. And they take around a horse's head on a stick, dressed up under sacking or cloth as a horse, and which is where we get our term hobby horse from. And the fertility of the animal on the stick is taken around to wassail. Now these seem to me like very old traditions and very much part of an agricultural season, an agricultural festival, used to bring about the fertility of the crops for the coming year. So it's not based on the darkness of the time, it's based on the positivity of bringing about abundance in the future. And tupping, of course, relates to the rutting of sheep, the mating of sheep. Now the mating of sheep actually takes place in around about autumn, and it has to be controlled by the farmer quite often to get the timing right. So they had to know what time of year, how many weeks before the spring, and of course the first lambs are born at Ivolk, at Ewe's Milk, which is the beginning of February, the end of January. And there is some correlation with old horse traditions, as they're called, and these are quite common in Britain, especially in the north of Britain and the northeast of Britain, as I said, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, Derbyshire, around this area, although you will find them in the south as well. And these actually may be related in some way, because these are the Anglo-Saxon and Viking lands. In the northeast, it's the easiest place to sail to if you're a Viking. And we are the descendants of the Vikings here, so it may actually, there's good correlation that it's related to old horse traditions in Scandinavia and in Germanic countries. And you'll find a lot about these on the internet if you look. They are related to the sacrifice to Odin of his sacred horses, which was a common Nordic Germanic theme. And what they did, which is a bit gross really, was they would kill horses, but they wouldn't take it lightly, because a horse was a very valuable animal and considered an extremely sacred animal. And they would hang the head on a pole. Sometimes they would drape the horse's skin over the pole. They would gather the blood in a bowl, and they would use twigs to then sprinkle the blood around the temples and around the statues of their gods. They would then eat the horse meat in a feast, and there was other things such as sacred vows taken at this time, which is where we get our tradition of our New Year's resolution. But however, their vows were so sacred that if they hadn't completed them by the final year, it would mean death. It was such a precious vow to take that you would die rather than fail. There's good evidence that these horse sacrifices and the tradition of the hobby horse and the gathering of the blood in a bowl are probably all related to this time of year, and of course the time of animal sacrifice as well, to bring fertility on the fields. And I do believe that the Nordic, Viking, Germanic people used blood quite often, and potent dedication, sacrifice to adorn trees and stones and things like that, things that were precious. And in Celtic tradition, it may be that the horse itself, oh, I forgot to mention something. So the horse's head on a stick could actually be used to be a curse, to be placed outside the village facing your enemy, and you could curse your enemy with this hideous contraption to us in our modern times. So it could be used as a curse, but it could also be seen as a protection, to ward off evil, really. So cursing in some ways is to keep your enemy at bay, isn't it? So there is some association with a sort of protective presence of aiming a horse's head in the direction of harm. And in Celtic tradition, the horse itself may actually be a symbol of the goddess of the land. And you can see this in many stories where a king marries a horse, or marries a mare, and the mare is seen as the land itself. Also, you can see in the tradition of Rhiannon and Epona, who was sacred to the Celts, and hill figures on hillsides of sacred white horses, some of which are modern, many of which are modern, but a couple are very ancient. They reckon the Uffington white horse stroke dragon is about at least 1000 BC, and there was another one which was the second oldest, which was about 800 AD. So these have historical significance and aren't just a modern sort of fad about, oh yeah, let's put a white horse on the hill. So these are quite significant, and also the horse stroke dragon relates to mummers' plays as well. So not only would they introduce the hobby horse, which was much more common in Morris dancing, but also in mummers' plays, but they also killed a dragon at this time of year on Christmas Day. And they would enact the killing of a dragon. You wouldn't often have a dragon, you just referred to the dragon. And he was killed by St George, or in mummers' plays there were two protagonists who would engage in combat, and whoever lost was then revived by a doctor. And the idea was the death and resurrection, as in nothing ever truly died, it was resurrected again. So these were parts of mummers' plays. So much of our Christmas tradition as we know it, has got to be said, is entirely pagan. Almost. There's very few people who put out a nativity scene, but it can be done. And what we have now associated with Christmas is Germanic in origin and Nordic in origin, with the story of Santa and the Elves and the Amanita Muscaria and everything we've heard about quite a lot. You may not have heard of the Christmas goat, which in ancient Scandinavian tradition was the bringer of gifts before Santa was the bringer of gifts. So before we had any notion of Santa who came from Lapland riding on his sleigh, it was actually a goat who came and brought gifts to the people at Christmas time. Now the goat can be made out of straw and decorated on a Christmas tree. That's very traditional. It's not something I know very much in our country, we don't do this. But it also relates to guisers, and especially to what we call straw boys, or what in Ireland they call straw boys, which seems to have agricultural and fertility ritual roots. Oh, it's hot. It's hot in my new Christmas jumper next to the fire. So anyway, later the Yule goat was replaced by the Nissen, which were house spirits which would come into your home at winter, and they were then said to traditionally take around gifts. Now I don't want to cover too much of the Germanic origins of Christmas because, you know, maybe that's an entire video in itself, and I don't want to say everything in one go. But I'd rather concentrate on some of these old Celtic traditions that I would rather didn't die. So I'm going to talk about the mummers and the guisers and the Morris dances. So the mummers traditionally performed on Christmas Day. They were also called guisers. And mummer and guiser actually translates as being in disguise. And the mummers and the guisers would often blacken their faces, as would people who were wassailing and as were people who were doing the old tup ritual. Now this became quite controversial because Morris dances, which I didn't know, actually derives its name from Moorish dancers, and of course Moors are black Spaniards. And so it met with accusations being racist, and Morris dancers were attacked in city centres, and they actually conceded and decided that they would no longer black their face, which I find quite sad, because we didn't really know much about black Spaniards until about the 15th century. And the mummers traditions and the wassailing traditions are much, much older, and so I presume is old tup. And I think these actually go far back into antiquity. And in my opinion, they perhaps got the name Moorish dancers as a new overlay onto an older tradition. Because of the blackening of the face, so they were perhaps called Moors, you know, dressing up like Moors. But the Morris dancers didn't really come along until the 1500s. They gained a lot of popularity in the 17th century. But perhaps based on older country dancing that would take place around this time. Now, one of these traditional dances was called the Molly Dance. And this would take place on Plough Monday, which, as we're far removed from agriculture these days, we may not know. Plough Monday is the first Monday after Twelfth Night, which is the 6th of January. And this is when the earth starts getting turned over again, ready for the new agricultural year. And at this time, a man would dress up in drag as a woman, and this is where it gets the name of Molly dancing. Also, the mummers, the wassailing, the married lwyd, which actually may mean grey mare, or it may be named after Holy Mary, but I suspect it's named actually grey mare tradition. Nobody knows where it comes from. They would go around with a Punch and Judy kind of characters, which is a man dressed up as a woman in its whole body. The man has a stick, he has a poker, the woman has a broom, and this seems quite a common theme as well. And they would knock on doors and come into your house and cause mischief, and you would pay them, and there was some association with begging and with charity. And perhaps being in disguise would hide your true identity if you are being a beggar. But it was charity given to people to oversee the harsh winter, to help them through the starving months, which were traditionally January and February. So this idea of getting dressed up and masking one's face, being in disguise and performing, and also being acrobatics and dressing up as animals was quite common. So they were the entertainers, and they would also perform plays in rhyme, in rhyming couplets, which is where they may have got the name rhymers from. Now, I have taken the name Rhymer as a writing name, but it's based on my mother's maiden name. And her maiden name was German, and I asked her once when I was very young, what does your name mean? and she replied it meant rhyming man, which I quite liked at the time, so it's a name I would like to adopt as a sort of pseudonym, you know. And I've got far too many consonants in my real name, so we'll just leave that at that. But yeah, that's the name Rhymer, so I quite like that. Maybe there's that tradition there. And this idea of wearing disguise in Ireland, I didn't know about this till last night. They have a tradition of straw boys, which are mummers and guisers, and they wear straw masks and dress up almost like straw bales. And they traditionally come around on Christmas Day. And actually it's St Stephen's Day, which is Boxing Day. So it's the tradition of straw boys, which takes place mainly in Ireland, as I can see. And this is where mummers and guisers dress up in almost like baskets on their head, and often with straw all over their bodies and costumes that look like walking straw bales. It's the only way I can describe it. And they have a tradition on St Stephen's Day, which in Irish is called, I will not be pronouncing this right, Lian Drialin, or it's called Wren Day. And the wren is a very sacred creature to Druids and Celts. It's a very prehistoric ancient custom of capturing a wren and attaching it to a bush adorned with ribbons, and then straw boys parading the wren from home to home, and also gathering money, and it's a baudy and comic kind of celebration where people get drunk and, you know, there's dancing and things like that. But the wren is the king of the birds to the Druids, so whatever this custom is, it's related to the very sacred tradition of the animal of the wren. And I only found out about this last night, so I'm not a great expert on this. But the fact that mummers and guisers and straw boys all are in disguise, cutting out their face, blackening their face, wearing masks as it were, it would seem to relate to some kind of ancient fertility ritual, shamanic almost in context, where the participants take on the role of the nature spirits and the gods. So they're beyond, like in Greek drama, you put on a mask to remove your human personality and put on the god's face. So it would seem to be like that to me. And of course then there are the Morris men who also perform traditionally on Christmas Day. Many people know them performing at May Day, but actually Christmas Day, Boxing Day and the day before Christmas, also sometimes New Year's Day. This is traditional, and this is when they go out and bang sticks together, bang the ground with sticks, wave bells, make noises, frighten away the evil spirits. And banging the sticks together seems to be waking the soil up to me. This is what it seems like. It's banging the fertility into the land to wake the ground again at the return of the midwinter sun. So I would say that there is an awful lot of the fertility rituals that we don't really recognise in Christmas anymore, and we are very much removed from the agricultural society. We go to supermarkets and we go to shopping malls, and this is what Christmas means to us. And in many ways it would be nice to wassail, it would be nice to Morris dance, it would be nice to create mass, you know, silly little mummers plays again. So I thought, although I may do something later about Yule, I didn't really want to concentrate on Yule. I'd like to talk a bit more about the whole Celtic flavour of Winter Solstice. And so not only do we remember to put in an evergreen tree which brings life into the depths of winter and invites in the nature spirit into your home at the coldest part of the year. But also remember that this celebration was very much about returning to life, returning to vitality, chasing away the darkness and waking the earth for the coming season. So if you do participate in winter solstice traditions or rituals, perhaps you'd like to, engage in some of these, adapt to, as much as you can, your own traditions, to the wassailing, to the honouring of the trees, to the giving the gifts, hanging gifts on the branches outdoors as well as in your own home, pouring ale on the earth, something like that. Just to remember the old spirit of the agricultural year being reborn. Okay, well I hope that was some use to you. I know I've waffled on quite a lot on this one, so thank you if you're still watching. I'd like to thank my subscribers. You're very kind people. It's lovely that you're here. And if you would like to introduce yourself, it would be really nice to get to know you in the comments box below. And whatever you're doing, I hope you have a good winter solstice and Merry Christmas too, and a Happy New Year. Thank you. Bye bye.